Sometimes the most powerful moments happen when we least expect them. In a world where royal protocol dictates every gesture and cameras capture every breath, what happens when two of the world's most watched individuals decide to throw caution to the wind? What unfolds when duty meets spontaneity, when formality collides with genuine human connection? This is the story of a single moment that changed everything, a playful exchange so unexpected, so authentic, that it left even the most seasoned royal watchers completely speechless. It's about discovering that behind the titles and tiaras, the most extraordinary people are often the most beautifully ordinary. Some stories define careers, others define relationships. But this story defines what it truly means to be human in a world that often forgets the power of simple, genuine moments. What you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about public life, personal connections, and the magic that happens when two people decide to just be themselves. The morning mist hung low over the grounds as Stirling adjusted his camera equipment for what he believed would be another routine royal engagement. 23 years of photographing the British royal family had taught him to expect the expected polished smiles, careful waves, and interactions choreographed down to the second. But today, something felt different in the air. Stirling had earned his reputation as one of Britain's most respected royal photographers through patience, discretion, and an almost supernatural ability to capture the perfect moment. His portfolio included coronations, weddings, state dinners, and countless official portraits that had graced magazine covers worldwide. Yet despite decades of experience, he still felt a flutter of anticipation before each assignment. Today's event was supposed to be straightforward, a visit to a local community center where William and Catherine would meet with volunteers and hear about ongoing charitable initiatives. The photographer checked his light meter one final time as the familiar black cars approached. He had positioned himself strategically near the entrance, knowing from experience exactly where the couple would pause for photographs. His assistant Sarah stood nearby with backup equipment, though Stirling rarely needed it. He was known for getting the shot right the first time. As the car doors opened, Stirling raised his camera instinctively. William emerged first, straightening his jacket and scanning the small crowd of onlookers who had gathered despite the early hour. Catherine followed, her smile genuine and warm as she acknowledged the waiting photographers and journalists. They moved through their arrival routine with practiced ease. A brief wave, a moment to speak with local officials, then toward the building entrance. But something caught Stirling's attention through his viewfinder. Catherine had stopped mid-stride, her attention drawn to something beyond the planned route. Following her gaze, Stirling spotted a small group of children who had somehow managed to slip past the security cordons. They were peeking around the corner of a nearby building, clearly trying to get a glimpse of the royal visitors while attempting to remain hidden. What happened next would replay in Stirling's mind for years to come. Instead of continuing toward the community center entrance as scheduled, Catherine gently touched William's arm and nodded toward the children. Without hesitation, William followed her lead as they approached the unexpected audience. The children's eyes grew wide as the couple walked directly toward them. One little girl, perhaps 6 years old, immediately tried to hide behind her older brother, while a boy with a gap-toothed grin stepped forward boldly. Catherine knelt to their level, and Stirling could see her saying something that made them all giggle. Then William did something that made Stirling nearly drop his camera. The future King of England got down on his hands and knees and began to crawl toward the children, making what appeared to be monster noises. The children squealed with delight, their initial shyness completely forgotten as they began to run in circles around the now growling prince. Stirling's professional instincts kicked in, and he began capturing frame after frame. But even as he worked, part of his mind couldn't quite process what he was witnessing. This wasn't in the schedule. This wasn't planned. This was pure, spontaneous joy happening in front of his lens. Catherine joined in the impromptu game, chasing the children while William continued his monster act. Security personnel looked on with bemused expressions, clearly uncertain about protocol for this particular situation. The official schedule had been completely abandoned, but nobody seemed to care. The photographer found himself smiling behind his camera as he continued shooting. In all his years of royal photography, he had captured many memorable moments, but nothing quite like this. There was something magical about watching two of the world's most formal individuals completely let go of pretense and simply play. One brave little boy approached William and patted him on the head, declaring him not scary at all. William responded by sitting up and pretending to be tamed, which sent the children into another fit of giggles. Catherine was spinning a little girl around while two other children tugged at her coat, demanding their turn. The community center officials who had been waiting to greet the royal couple stood watching from the entrance, their carefully prepared speeches temporarily forgotten. Some smiled at the unexpected scene, while others checked their watches nervously, but the royal couple seemed oblivious to any concerns about timing or protocol. Stirling realized he was witnessing something extraordinary, a moment of pure humanity from two people who rarely had the luxury of such spontaneity. His camera captured Catherine's genuine laughter as a toddler tried to climb into her arms, and William's surprised expression when one of the boys attempted to tie his shoelaces together. As the impromptu play session continued, more children appeared from seemingly nowhere. Word had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and parents began arriving with their little ones in tow. What had started as an encounter with a handful of hidden children was rapidly becoming an informal meet and greet. William and Catherine showed no signs of wanting to end the interaction. They moved from child to child, giving each one individual attention. William found himself in an animated conversation with a 7-year-old about football, while Catherine listened intently as a shy girl whispered something in her ear. Stirling continued photographing but found himself increasingly drawn into the emotional reality of what he was witnessing, rather than just the technical aspects of capturing it. These weren't the careful, measured interactions typical of royal engagements. This was raw, unscripted connection, happening in real time. The photographer noticed how naturally William and Catherine worked together, seamlessly tag-teaming to ensure no child felt left out. When one little boy seemed overwhelmed by the attention, Catherine gently drew him aside for a quieter conversation, while William continued entertaining the more boisterous children. As minutes turned into what felt like hours, the original schedule became increasingly irrelevant. The community center visit would have to wait. The volunteers inside would have to extend their patience, because something more important was happening outside, something that couldn't be planned or scripted or managed. Stirling lowered his camera for a moment, simply watching as William pretended to struggle against an attack from 5 giggling children who were attempting to tackle him. Catherine cheered them on, calling out strategic advice about his weak spots. The scene was so natural, so joyful, that it took Stirling's breath away. This was the moment that would change everything, though none of them knew it yet. As Stirling raised his camera again to continue capturing the unexpected magic unfolding before him, he had no idea that these photographs would become some of the most talked-about images of the decade. The morning had started like any other, but it was quickly becoming clear that nothing about this day would be ordinary. And for a photographer who had thought he had seen everything the royal family had to offer, Stirling was about to discover he had seen nothing yet. What started as a simple game was evolving into something much more profound. Stirling watched through his lens as William found himself surrounded by 8 children, all demanding different things at once. One wanted him to roar like a lion, another insisted he should hop like a rabbit, while a third tugged at his sleeve asking if he lived in a real castle. Instead of being overwhelmed, William seemed to thrive in the chaos. He attempted to satisfy each request in turn, producing what could generously be called animal impressions, while answering questions about royal life in terms a child could understand. When asked about his crown, he explained that he only wore it on very special days, and that it was actually quite heavy, and sometimes gave him a headache. Catherine had become the center of attention for the younger children, particularly the girls who were fascinated by her coat, her hair, and especially her jewelry. She patiently answered questions about whether she had ever met a fairy, no, but she would like to, whether her shoes hurt her feet, sometimes, and if she could do magic, only the magic of making William laugh. Stirling found himself adjusting his position repeatedly to capture the constantly shifting dynamics of the group. Just when he thought he had the perfect shot lined up, someone would move or a new child would enter the frame. It was unlike any royal engagement he had ever photographed. There was no central focus, no predetermined positions, just organic interaction flowing in every direction. The photographer became aware of murmurs from the growing crowd of adults who had gathered to watch. Parents were pulling out their phones, but something about the intimacy of the moment seemed to discourage them from getting too close. It was as if everyone understood they were witnessing something special that shouldn't be disturbed. Meanwhile, the official schedule was falling apart completely. Stirling could see private secretaries huddled in conversation near the community center entrance, occasionally glancing at their watches and then at the royal couple who showed no signs of wrapping up their impromptu play session. Security personnel maintained their positions but seemed to have relaxed their usual vigilance. Perhaps sensing that this crowd posed no threat, William had now progressed to giving piggyback rides, something that definitely wasn't covered in any protocol manual. A brave 8-year-old had climbed aboard and William was galloping around the small area while making horse noises. The child's laughter was infectious, and even the most serious-looking security officers couldn't help but smile. Catherine, meanwhile, had organized the remaining children into what appeared to be an impromptu dance circle. She was teaching them a simple clapping game, her voice clear and encouraging as she helped them with the rhythm. Stirling captured the concentration on the children's faces as they tried to master the pattern, and the gentle patience in Catherine's expression as she guided them. The photographer realized he was no longer thinking about technical settings or composition rules. His years of experience had taken over on an automatic level, leaving his conscious mind free to simply absorb the emotional impact of what he was witnessing. This wasn't just a photo opportunity. It was a masterclass in human connection. One particularly bold little girl had appointed herself as Catherine's stylist and was attempting to rearrange her hair. Catherine submitted to the makeover with good grace, offering gentle suggestions when the child's enthusiasm threatened to create complete chaos. The result was delightfully lopsided, but Catherine wore her new hairstyle with apparent pride. William, having completed his circuit as a horse, was now being recruited for a game that seemed to involve him pretending to be various pieces of playground equipment. He found himself acting as a slide, then a swing, then something that might have been intended as a seesaw but looked more like an extremely patient human jungle gym. Stirling marveled at how naturally both William and Catherine had adapted to this unexpected situation. There was no awkwardness, no sense that they were performing for cameras or fulfilling obligations. They seemed genuinely delighted to be there, completely absorbed in the children's world. The interactions became increasingly complex as the children grew more comfortable. They began sharing stories about their pets, their school, their siblings. William found himself mediating a disagreement between two boys about whose dog was faster, while Catherine listened sympathetically to a little girl's detailed explanation of why she didn't like vegetables. As the impromptu gathering continued, Stirling noticed how the children began to forget entirely who they were playing with. To them, William and Catherine had simply become two fun adults who were willing to play games and listen to their stories. The royal titles and formal roles had completely dissolved in the face of genuine human interaction. The photographer captured Catherine's expression of surprise and delight when one little boy presented her with a dandelion he had picked from a crack in the pavement, declaring it the most beautiful flower in the world. She accepted it with the same grace she might show for a formal bouquet, immediately tucking it behind her ear where it remained for the rest of the encounter. William was deep in conversation with a group of older children who had begun asking more sophisticated questions. They wanted to know what it was like to meet presidents and prime ministers, whether he had ever been scared during official ceremonies, and if he really had to eat fancy food all the time, or if he could have pizza when he wanted. His answers were refreshingly honest and age-appropriate. Yes, he had been nervous during big ceremonies. No, he didn't like all fancy food. And yes, pizza was definitely better sometimes. The children nodded sagely at these revelations, as if these insights into royal life confirmed their own suspicions about the adult world. The scene had attracted attention from beyond just the immediate neighborhood. Stirling could see other photographers arriving, drawn by word that something unusual was happening. But there was an unspoken agreement among them to maintain a respectful distance. The magic of the moment seemed to demand it. Catherine had now been recruited as the judge for an impromptu talent show. Children were lining up to demonstrate their various skills: cartwheels, silly songs, impressions of their teachers. She applauded each performance with enthusiasm, offering specific compliments that showed she was genuinely paying attention. Meanwhile, William had somehow become involved in what appeared to be a complex negotiation about the rules for a new game the children were inventing. It involved running, jumping, making animal noises, and something called the royal spin, which seemed to require spinning with arms outstretched while making crown-wearing faces. The photographer found himself laughing out loud as he captured William attempting to master the royal spin under the serious instruction of his young coaches. The concentration on the future king's face as he tried to perfect this completely made-up move was absolutely priceless. As the encounter stretched on, it became clear that this wasn't just a brief detour from the official schedule. It was becoming the main event. The community center visit, the prepared speeches, the carefully planned photo opportunities were all being upstaged by something infinitely more valuable: authentic human connection happening in real time. Stirling realized he was witnessing history in the making, though perhaps not the kind that would make headlines in traditional ways. This was the kind of history that lived in hearts and memories, the kind that reminded everyone watching why the monarchy endured, not because of pomp and ceremony, but because of moments like this when titles fell away, and what remained was simply human kindness and joy. The morning sun was climbing higher, and somewhere in the back of his mind, Stirling knew that eventually this magical interlude would have to end. But for now, time seemed suspended in a bubble of laughter and play, where the most important people in the kingdom were content to be exactly where they were, doing exactly what they were doing, with exactly the right people to share it with. The dynamics of the gathering had shifted into something resembling organized chaos. What began as a chance encounter had evolved into a full-scale community event, with more families arriving every few minutes. Word had spread through the neighborhood with remarkable speed, and Stirling found himself documenting not just a royal interaction, but a genuine community moment. Catherine had somehow become the leader of an impromptu art project. Using twigs, leaves, and various bits of debris the children had collected, they were creating what one little girl proudly announced was a sculpture for the Queen. Catherine entered into the project with complete seriousness, offering suggestions about balance and color while praising the children's creativity. William, meanwhile, had been recruited as the star player in an increasingly elaborate game of tag that had evolved to include complex rules about safe zones, special powers, and something called royal immunity that the children had invented specifically for him. He was currently crouched behind a small tree, apparently hiding from a 6-year-old who was it and took his responsibility very seriously. Stirling marveled at how completely both royal visitors had abandoned any pretense of formality. William's hair was disheveled from crawling around and playing various games, while Catherine had dirt on her knees from kneeling to the children's level and grass stains on her coat from sitting on the ground during story time. The photographer captured the moment when William was finally caught in the tag game, his expression of exaggerated defeat causing an eruption of giggles from his young captors. They insisted he had to pay a penalty, which apparently involved singing a song of their choosing. William gamely attempted a rendition of Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star, with interpretive dance moves suggested by his audience. Catherine's art project had grown increasingly ambitious. What started as a simple leaf sculpture had evolved into something that required engineering consultation from several 8-year-olds who considered themselves experts in construction. She listened intently to their advice about structural integrity while helping smaller children contribute their own artistic elements. The scene had attracted the attention of local shopkeepers and residents, who began emerging from nearby buildings. An elderly woman from across the street had brought out a chair and was sitting in her doorway, beaming as she watched the proceedings. A local cafe owner had appeared with a tray of juice boxes, which were gratefully accepted by the increasingly energetic children. Stirling noticed how naturally William and Catherine had divided responsibilities, each playing to their strengths while ensuring all the children felt included. When one shy little boy seemed overwhelmed by the bigger group, William quietly drew him aside for a one-on-one conversation about his favorite animals. Meanwhile, Catherine organized the more boisterous children into a group activity that channeled their energy constructively. The formal schedule had been completely abandoned at this point. Stirling could see royal staff members engaged in what appeared to be increasingly animated phone conversations, presumably with other venues and officials who were expecting the couple's arrival. But William and Catherine seemed oblivious to these concerns, completely absorbed in their young companions. One particularly precocious 7-year-old had begun interviewing Catherine with the seriousness of a professional journalist. She wanted to know about Catherine's daily routine, her favorite foods, whether she had pets, and if she ever got bored living in a palace. Catherine answered each question thoughtfully, treating her young interviewer with the same respect she would show to any member of the press. William had become embroiled in what appeared to be a complex diplomatic negotiation. Two groups of children had formed competing teams for some elaborate game they were inventing, and they needed him to serve as both referee and peace negotiator. He was taking his role very seriously, listening to each side's arguments and proposing compromises with the gravity of someone mediating international treaties. The photographer found himself increasingly moved by the children's responses to the royal couple. There was no deference, no intimidation, just pure joy at having found two adults who were willing to enter their world completely. They treated William and Catherine like favorite relatives who had come to visit, and the royal couple responded in kind. Catherine's interview had evolved into a storytelling session. The children were taking turns sharing their own stories about lost teeth, new pets, adventures at school, and dreams for the future. She listened to each tale with complete attention, asking follow-up questions and responding with appropriate amazement or sympathy. Meanwhile, William had successfully negotiated the game rules and was now serving as captain of one team in what appeared to be a modified version of Capture the Flag. His competitive spirit had clearly emerged, and he was taking his team's strategy very seriously, while still ensuring everyone was having fun. Stirling realized he had been photographing for over an hour, far longer than any typical royal engagement. His camera battery was running low, but he couldn't bring himself to stop shooting. Every few minutes brought a new moment of unexpected beauty or humor that demanded to be captured. The community center officials had eventually given up waiting and had come outside to join the impromptu gathering. They brought folding chairs for the elderly residents who had gathered to watch, and someone had produced a thermos of tea that was being passed around among the adults. What struck Stirling most powerfully was how this unplanned encounter had created a sense of genuine community. Neighbors who might normally just nod to each other in passing were engaged in animated conversations. Children from different families were playing together seamlessly. And at the center of it all, two of the most recognizable people in the world were completely at ease, as if this was exactly where they belonged. Catherine had discovered that one little girl was learning to read and had offered to help her with a picture book someone had brought from home. They sat together on the ground, Catherine's finger following along as the child sounded out words, both of them completely absorbed in the story. William's Capture the Flag game had evolved into something that resembled a combination of rugby, theater, and interpretive dance. He was currently demonstrating what he claimed was a stealth approach to the opposing team's flag, crawling commando-style across the grass while providing his own sound effect. The photographer captured the moment when William's stealth mission was discovered by a particularly alert 4-year-old on the opposing team. The child's triumphant shout of "I see you!" and William's theatrical collapse of defeat brought cheers from both teams and applause from the watching adults. As the morning progressed toward noon, Stirling began to wonder how this magical interlude would eventually end. The children showed no signs of tiring. William and Catherine seemed completely content to continue playing, and the growing crowd of adult observers appeared happy to settle in for the duration. But perhaps more importantly, the photographer realized he was witnessing something that would resonate far beyond this single morning. In a world increasingly divided by formality and distance, by screens and schedules and rigid protocols, here was proof that the most powerful connections happened when people simply allowed themselves to be human together. The images he was capturing would tell a story that went far beyond a royal engagement gone off schedule. They would document a moment when two people chose connection over protocol, when spontaneity triumphed over planning, and when the simple act of playing with children reminded everyone watching what truly mattered in life. As he continued photographing, Stirling knew he was creating a visual record of something extraordinary. A reminder that the most important moments often happen when we least expect them, and that sometimes the best thing we can do is simply show up fully for whatever unfolds. As the extraordinary morning continued to unfold, Stirling became aware that he was documenting more than just an impromptu play session. He was capturing a transformation both in the royal couple and in everyone who witnessed their spontaneous abandonment of protocol. Catherine had somehow become the conductor of an impromptu children's choir. What started as a simple singing game had evolved into a full performance, with children volunteering solos, duets, and even what one ambitious 8-year-old announced as an opera song, "I made up myself." Catherine listened to each performance with the same attention she might give to a concert at the Royal Opera House, offering specific praise and gentle encouragement. William, meanwhile, had been elected mayor of what the children had declared to be Playground Kingdom. His first official act, according to his young constituents, was to establish the right of every citizen to have ice cream for breakfast at least once a week. His second decree involved mandatory daily playtime for all adults, which he solemnly promised to enforce personally. The photographer found himself laughing as he captured William's mock-serious expression while delivering these proclamations. The children took their roles as citizens very seriously, raising their hands to ask questions about governance and proposing additional laws for their new kingdom. The informal community gathering had continued to grow throughout the morning. Local businesses had quietly contributed to the festivities. The corner shop owner had brought out packages of biscuits. Someone had produced a football that had immediately been put to use, and an elderly gentleman had arrived with a bag of penny sweets that he distributed with great ceremony. Stirling noticed how naturally William and Catherine had adapted their energy to match different groups of children throughout the morning. With the toddlers, they were gentle and patient, speaking softly and moving slowly. With the older children, they were more animated and playful, matching their enthusiasm while still maintaining a caring watchfulness. Catherine's choir had now organized itself into what appeared to be a complex musical arrangement involving clapping, stomping, and what the children called silly voices. She had somehow memorized each child's preferred contribution and was conducting them with the same attention to detail she might bring to any official function. William's mayoral duties had expanded to include settling disputes, organizing activities, and what appeared to be an ongoing negotiation about the placement of various royal monuments that the children were constructing around the area. Each monument seemed to have a specific purpose and required his official approval before installation. The photographer realized that what made this encounter so remarkable wasn't just the spontaneity, but the complete authenticity of William and Catherine's engagement. There was nothing performative about their interactions, no awareness of cameras or concern about image. They were simply being themselves in the purest possible way. One of the most touching moments Stirling captured was when a little girl with obvious developmental delays, approached Catherine shyly. Instead of the sometimes awkward interactions that such moments could produce, Catherine immediately sat down to the child's level and began a conversation about the little girl's favorite things. Within minutes, they were deep in discussion about butterflies, and Catherine was teaching her a simple hand game that the child could manage easily. Meanwhile, William had noticed a boy who was sitting slightly apart from the group, watching but not participating. Instead of trying to coax him into the activities, William simply sat down beside him and began a quiet conversation. Stirling watched through his lens as the boy gradually relaxed, eventually agreeing to help William with some of his mayoral paperwork, which appeared to involve drawing pictures of the various laws they were establishing. The sense of community that had developed around this impromptu gathering was unlike anything Stirling had witnessed in decades of public events. Neighbors were sharing stories, children were making new friends across age groups, and adults were rediscovering the simple pleasure of watching children play. Catherine's choir had attracted the attention of some teenage girls who had been initially too cool to participate, but found themselves drawn in by the infectious joy of the performance. Catherine immediately found roles for them as assistant conductors, giving them responsibility for different sections of the group and treating their contributions with the same respect she showed the younger children. William's playground kingdom had established its first diplomatic relationship with what the children declared to be the Sandbox Nation, apparently a sovereign territory located near the community center's playground. He was currently engaged in treaty negotiations with the Sandbox ambassador, a very serious 5-year-old who had drawn up what appeared to be an actual document outlining terms of cooperation. The photographer captured the moment when William, with great ceremony, signed the treaty using a crayon provided by the ambassador. The children erupted in cheers, and someone suggested they needed a celebration to mark this historic moment of international cooperation. What followed was perhaps the most joyful scene Stirling had ever witnessed. The celebration involved dancing, singing, more of William's animal impressions, and something that could generously be called a parade around the small area. Catherine led a condo line while William served as the parade marshal, complete with a paper crown that had been hastily constructed by his advisors. As the celebration continued, Stirling became increasingly aware that this wasn't just a pleasant distraction from official duties. It was something much more significant. In a world where public figures were increasingly distant and managed, here was a demonstration of genuine human connection happening in real time. The children had completely forgotten that they were playing with some of the most famous people in the world. To them, William and Catherine had simply become two wonderful adults who understood the importance of play, who listened to their stories, and who treated their games and ideas with respect. Catherine had been recruited to judge what appeared to be an increasingly elaborate competition involving creative uses for fallen leaves. The children were presenting their entries with the seriousness of contestants at a major exhibition, and she was giving each creation the careful consideration it deserved. William, meanwhile, had become involved in what seemed to be a complex engineering project. Several children were attempting to build what they described as the world's best fort, using nothing but sticks and leaves, and they needed his expertise as someone who lived in actual castles. The photographer found himself moved by the small gestures he was capturing. William's gentle help when a child struggled with a difficult task, Catherine's patient explanation when someone needed clarification about game rules, the natural way they both ensured that every child felt included and valued. As the morning stretched toward afternoon, the magic of the encounter seemed to intensify rather than diminish. New children continued to arrive, drawn by word of the amazing adults who were playing in their neighborhood. Each addition to the group was welcomed warmly by both the original participants and the royal couple. Stirling realized he was documenting something that would be remembered long after official state functions were forgotten. These children would carry this memory with them for the rest of their lives, not just the fact that they had met future monarchs, but the experience of being truly seen and valued by adults who chose to enter their world completely. The community center officials had long since given up any attempt to maintain the original schedule. Instead, they had joined the celebration, contributing their own skills and enthusiasm to the various activities that had emerged organically throughout the morning. What had begun as a simple encounter between hidden children and passing royalty had evolved into something approaching a neighborhood festival. And at its heart were two people who had made a choice that morning to value human connection over royal protocol, spontaneity over scheduling, and joy over duty. As Stirling continued photographing, he knew that these images would tell a story that transcended typical royal coverage. They would document a moment when authenticity triumphed over artifice, when the most powerful people chose to be simply human, and when an entire community was reminded of what really mattered in life. As the afternoon sun began to cast longer shadows across the impromptu gathering, Stirling sensed that this extraordinary encounter was approaching its natural conclusion. But rather than winding down gradually, the energy seemed to be building towards something special, a finale worthy of the magical morning that had unfolded. The children had organized themselves into what they announced was a surprise show for William and Catherine. Using props they had gathered throughout the day, leaves, sticks, flowers, and various items contributed by neighboring adults, they had created costumes and were preparing what appeared to be a theatrical production. Catherine had been gently guided to a makeshift royal box, a folding chair decorated with dandelions and surrounded by the day's artistic creations. William was offered the seat of honor beside her, though he was immediately recruited as special advisor to help with last-minute costume adjustments and prop placement. Stirling positioned himself to capture what promised to be the culmination of this unprecedented day. His camera had documented hours of spontaneous joy, but something about the children's earnest preparations suggested this final act would be particularly memorable. The production that unfolded was unlike anything in the history of royal entertainment. It began with a parade of animals, children crawling, hopping, and flying around the performance area while making corresponding sounds. This was followed by what appeared to be a dance interpretation of the morning's events, with various children playing the roles of William, Catherine, and even Stirling himself. The photographer found himself laughing as he watched a 7-year-old's interpretation of his photography style, complete with exaggerated focusing gestures and serious expressions. The child had clearly been observing him throughout the morning and had captured his mannerisms with startling accuracy. Catherine was delighted by her young impersonator, who had somehow managed to approximate her speaking style and mannerisms. The child curtsied repeatedly throughout her performance, offered to shake hands with everyone in sight, and demonstrated what she claimed was the princess wave she had learned by watching carefully all morning. William's portrayal was even more elaborate. The boy who had taken on this role had clearly studied his subject intently, reproducing William's posture, his hand gestures, and even attempting versions of the various animal sounds he had made throughout the day. The performance included dramatic reenactments of the morning's games, complete with slow-motion versions of particularly memorable moments. As the theatrical presentation continued, Stirling became aware that this wasn't just children putting on a show. It was their way of processing and celebrating an experience that had clearly affected them deeply. Through their play, they were making sense of a morning that had been unlike anything in their young lives. The performance evolved to include musical numbers, with Catherine's earlier choir reassembling to provide soundtrack for the dramatic scenes. The combination of singing, acting, and interpretive dance created a production that was simultaneously chaotic and charming, amateur and absolutely perfect. William and Catherine proved to be an excellent audience, gasping at dramatic moments, applauding enthusiastically after each number, and providing encouraging commentary throughout. Their genuine enjoyment of the children's creativity was evident in every reaction Stirling captured. The show's finale involved all the children forming a large circle around the royal couple. They had prepared speeches, ranging from thank you notes written in crayon to elaborate poems composed on the spot. Each child who wanted to speak was given the opportunity, and William and Catherine listened to every word with complete attention. One little girl had prepared what she announced was a proper royal speech. Standing as tall as her 4-year-old frame would allow, she declared that William and Catherine were the best grown-ups ever, and that they should come back to play again soon. She concluded by presenting Catherine with a crown made of woven grass and flowers, proclaiming her the Queen of Fun. William's tribute came from the boy who had served as Sandbox ambassador earlier in the day. With great ceremony, he presented William with an official document declaring him honorary president of all the playgrounds forever. The document, illustrated with elaborate crayon drawings, included an impressive list of duties and privileges that apparently came with the position. As the formal presentations continued, Stirling realized he was documenting something historically significant, though not in the traditional sense. This wasn't the kind of history that would appear in official records or royal biographies. This was personal history, the kind that lives in hearts and memories, that shapes how children understand the world and their place in it. Catherine had been moved to tears by the children's presentations, though she maintained her composure throughout the ceremony. When the final speech was concluded, she stood and addressed the group with the same care she might bring to any official engagement. She thanked each child by name. Somehow, throughout the chaotic mornings, she had learned all their names and something special about each one. Her words were simple but heartfelt, acknowledging not just the fun they had shared, but the lessons she had learned from spending time with them. William's address was equally thoughtful. He spoke about the importance of play, the value of imagination, and the joy he had found in their company. He promised to remember this day always and to carry the lessons of Playground Kingdom with him in his official duties. Then came the moment that would define Stirling's career as a royal photographer. As William and Catherine prepared to finally leave, the children spontaneously began singing "Thank You" to the tune of "Happy Birthday." But halfway through the song, Catherine began to cry. Not sad tears, but tears of pure joy and gratitude. William immediately put his arm around her, and without any discussion or planning, both of them began to sing along. Soon the entire crowd, children, parents, shopkeepers, community center officials, even the security personnel, were all singing together in a moment of perfect unity. Stirling's camera captured it all. The tears of joy, the embracing figures, the circle of faces united in song. The late afternoon light casting everything in golden warmth. But more than that, he captured the emotion of a moment that had transformed everyone present. As the song ended, the children rushed forward for final hugs and handshakes. William and Catherine moved through the group slowly, making sure to say goodbye to each child individually. There were promises to remember the day, requests for return visits, and more than a few tears from both children and adults. The actual departure, when it finally came, was gentle and natural. No dramatic exits or formal farewells, just two people who had spent an extraordinary day with new friends, walking slowly toward their car while waving goodbye to a crowd that had become, for one perfect day, like family. Stirling continued photographing until the royal car disappeared from view, then lowered his camera and looked around at the scene of the day's magic. The community center engagement had been completely forgotten, the official schedule abandoned entirely, but what had happened instead was infinitely more valuable. As he began packing his equipment, the photographer reflected on what he had witnessed and documented. In a world increasingly divided by formality and distance, by social media facades and carefully managed public images, he had captured something raw and real and transformative. The children were still buzzing with excitement, recreating favorite moments and planning ways to remember the day. The adults were sharing contact information, making plans for future gatherings, talking about how the morning had reminded them of what really mattered. Stirling knew that when these photographs were published, they would spark conversations about authenticity, about the role of public figures, about the importance of human connection in an increasingly disconnected world. They would become some of the most beloved images in royal photography, not because of their technical perfection, but because of the genuine emotion they captured. But more importantly, he knew that everyone present had been changed by the experience. The children would carry this memory of adults who valued their ideas and entered their world completely. The parents had witnessed leadership that prioritized people over protocol. The community had experienced the magic that happens when barriers dissolve and people simply show up for each other. As Stirling drove away, he realized he had been left speechless not by any single moment, but by the accumulation of moments that had created something extraordinary. A day that had begun as routine royal coverage had become a master class in human connection, a reminder that the most powerful moments often happen when we least expect them. The photographs would tell the story, but the real impact of this unexpected day would live on in the hearts and minds of everyone who had experienced it. And for a photographer who had spent decades capturing carefully orchestrated moments, there was something profoundly moving about having documented pure, unscripted joy. The title of Photographer Left Speechless had never been more appropriate, not because he couldn't find words to describe what had happened, but because what had happened transcended words entirely. It was a reminder that sometimes the most important things in life can only be felt, experienced, and shared through the simple act of being genuinely present with one another.